All right. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Columbia Slough Watershed Council's webinar today on climate change, rising rivers, and rainstorm runoff. My name is Ryan Banning, and I am the Community Partnerships and Events Director with the Council. I want to thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to our panelists as well for being here and spending some time to discuss this with us. Before I turn things over to our Executive Director, I'm going to go over a few housekeeping rules and just kind of talk through Zoom in case folks are unfamiliar. All of the participants will be muted and your video will be off. If you do have questions for our participants throughout this webinar, there is a Q&A feature on the lower right hand of the Zoom. You can click on that and type in a question. Our official Q&A session will start at roughly about 6:30, 6:35. But feel free to put questions as they arise in there. If you do see individuals with a question that you like as well, you can simply tap it or like it, and with more likes, it will rise to the top, and we'll make sure it gets answered. There also is a gallery view or a speaker view button in the top right section if you'd like to make sure you're focusing on the speakers. Otherwise, you'll see all of our faces. So that's it for housekeeping at this point. I'd like to turn it over to Kathy.
Thank you, Ryan. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Kathy Kellen, the Executive Director with the Columbia Slough Watershed Council. We're a small nonprofit that's been working since 1994 to enhance and protect the Columbia Slough and its watershed through education, stewardship, and community engagement. In that spirit of learning and discovery, we have tonight's webinar, which is our second this spring, on the topic of flooding. And tonight's theme within that is climate change. And we're going to go from big picture ideas about an understanding of climate change and issues and risks associated with that to looking at local potential impacts, and then back out again with our 4 researchers from around the Pacific Northwest. The format for tonight is I'm going to hand it off to each presenter in turn. They'll introduce themselves and then share a presentation that they've put together that'll give you a better sense of their work. And after we've heard from everyone, I'll open up the conversation to questions from attendees. As Ryan said, feel free to pose your questions anytime in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and Ryan will help sort through those for our Q&A period. So let's kick things off. Guillaume, you've prepared a very nice overview of some key with respect to climate change impacts and flood risks. Take it away, please.
All right, thanks, Kathy. I'm just here to introduce myself. My name is Guillaume Mauger. I'm a research scientist at the Climate Impacts Group at the University of Washington in Seattle, and my work really focuses on trying to bridge the gap between science and practice on climate change and flooding in particular. All right, go ahead, Ryan, thanks.
Okay, thanks for having me tonight. So I'm going to talk, my talk is really going to be focused on a little bit of more of a planning and preparing for climate change focus, and I'm going to put that in the context of some of the impacts that we think about in places like the Columbia Slough. So I want to start by just pointing out that there are quite a bit of organizations that work on kind of bridging the gap between science and practice on climate change. We are one of them. That's us under the Washington heading on the left here, the Climate Impacts Group. We have close colleagues at Oregon State University in Corvallis, the Climate Impacts Research Consortium, or CIRC. And there's other academics across the region, as well as federal agencies that are doing a lot of this work as well. Lots of resources to go after and worth knowing about. Okay, and so I want to just talk in one slide about the variety of, brief overview of the variety of climate change effects that we could be seeing in the slough. So this is sort of my goofy watershed schematic. And now first talking about the big river impacts that are worth knowing about and that you'll hear about from some of the other speakers. So first, sea level rise, it's surprising. We're pretty far upstream here, but as sea level rises further and further, there will start to be some tidal effect from sea level rise. Probably not the biggest issue, but worth knowing about. Bigger issue, of course, are changes in stream flow on the Columbia River. Even with all the dams, there will be changes, potentially big ones, and you'll hear more about that, folks. One of the big drivers of that is declining snowpacks. There's a lot of high mountain source regions for the Columbia River. And that's going to be a dramatic change over the coming century as temperatures warm. Much less dramatic change. There's a tendency among models for wetter winters. Not all models say that, and the changes are pretty small, so it's a pretty minor effect. A much more important effect is that we do project, the model is pretty consistent in showing that heavy rain events are going to get more intense in the future, so heavier rain events in the future. We do have more than the wetter winter signal, which, like I was saying, is pretty weak. There's a stronger signal and greater agreement among models that summers are going to get drier. That combined with a longer growing season. Longer growing season is good in general for ag, right? Promotes growth, but it could also be bad for ag because it promotes growth in other things like invasives or pests. It also could mean greater water demand, which combined with drier summers could mean more shortages in water in the future. And in general, we expect stream flow to go down in summer, again, because of that declining snowpack issue. And the final effect I just wanted to tick off, and this isn't everything, it's kind of a quick overview, is we do expect wildfire to be more frequent, greater area in the future. And that's related to some of these other factors that I've noted as well. Okay, so that's a quick overview of the kinds of impacts that I'm thinking about when I think about places like the slough. Now I want to just step back and think about how we think about climate change risks more broadly. And we generally think of that as breaking down into three factors. And the technical terms for these are 1, exposure, 2, sensitivity, and 3, adaptive capacity. So what do those mean? The first, exposure, is really how much is the climate going to change, or what is, how much is the change that's going to happen. Second, sensitivity. Another way of saying that is when does it matter, or how much would it have to change to matter? And the third is really what is our capacity or our ability to respond to and prepare for those changes in an answer session. So this first example, how much change, and this is just a quick video that shows me navigating through a tool. This is a tool we recently created that mines our new, we have a new set of model projections that look at changes in heavy rainfall intensity. And this allows folks to drill into a specific location and look at what those projections show. So I'm showing some examples for Portland, just west of the slough. These are a little bit technical. They're geared towards stormwater professionals. This gives you a taste of the kinds of projections that we develop. The idea here is to develop information that's as drilled down, as close to what you would need to plan for or make a decision making regarding climate change in terms of the impacts, right? Okay, so that's the first, how much change is going to happen. One example. Second is, when does it matter, or how much would it have to change to matter? And this picture kind of drives that point home. So this is I-5 during the famous Chehalis River flood of 2009. Some of you may remember or be familiar with the fact that I-5 shut down twice in recent memory, in 2007 and 2009. This was one of those events. This really kind of drives home that second one, right? Because we can provide projections for how much river levels are going to go up with climate change, but it's a whole other thing entirely to know how much they have to go up to flood I-5, right? And you could think of other examples, right? How much they have to go up to flood my floorboards, right? Or, going beyond flooding, when do water temperatures make it impossible for salmon to spawn? Or at what point do heat waves, what's the consequence of increasing frequency and intensity of heat waves for public health, right? How do the impacts scale of our work for the past couple of decades is really focused on that first one, how much climate is going to change. And we're realizing as a field, these other pieces are really important and need to get more attention. What's interesting about this one is that local expertise is far more important than expertise like mine, right? Because people who live and experience these or manage these kinds of issues in the area, they have a much better idea, and this can include many of you in the audience, of when the impacts happen, what matters, and how we should measure those impacts. All right, so an example of us getting at that is we've been doing some work supporting climate change planning and integrated floodplain management in Pierce County. Pierce County is the county that Tacoma sits in. It goes all the way up into Mount Rainier. And they've been embarking on this big integrated floodplain management effort, like many areas, where they're trying to work across interest stakeholder groups. And that's in many cases focusing on what are often referred to as the 3 Fs: floods, farms, and fish, all 3 of which are represented in this image. So we came in and we started to talk to them about the climate change impacts and how those relate to the integrated planning. We came up with this table, and this is just one illustration of starting to get at this idea. When do impacts, or how much would they have to change to measure? And this table just shows, on the left is a variety of impacts, not just flooding, things like low flows and water temperatures and so on. And on the columns are the different ways that the fish, farms, and floods could be impacted. And this allows us to get into a couple of things. One, where the impacts are shared across different interests, so there's potential for coordination. And another one, how the impacts span across a bunch of different types of impacts, right? And so we could think about ways to manage those in concert. Okay, so that's one example. All right, so stepping back before I talk about the third, and I just want to note for a moment how valuable floodplains are, right? They're valuable for farming, they're valuable for infrastructure, private property, cultural value, recreation value, also hugely valuable for habitat, right? And that's not just aquatic habitat, but also terrestrial, as all of you probably know. And that kind of hints at this third issue, which is what is our capacity to adapt, or what is our ability to prepare and respond to climate change? Right? And this is really where the rubber meets the road in climate and preparing for climate change, right? Because it is getting at questions like, what are the economic resources? What are the institutions that are going to be responsible for responding to climate change? And do they have what they need to respond? What's the community support for action? What kind of social cohesion is there? Is there good cooperation, right? Is there a shared sense of what to do? Are all the voices included in the planning process, and are their needs prioritized and translated into actions? Right? So these are some really critical questions that relate to the effectiveness of planning for climate change. And like I said, we as a field have realized that we focused a lot on those impacts and less on these latter 2. So I will stop there. My contact information is here. Please feel free to get in touch, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you. Okay, thanks for having me.
Thank you, Guillaume. I really appreciated your approach of providing a framework. And so with your permission, wanted to riff on that and use that idea, sort of the 3 factors that influence risk, as a way to also stage the following presentations. And so next slide, please. So we're going to hear next from Keith and Susan, who worked on a research study for Lardy, Columbia, and Multnomah County Drainage District system that was really posing these questions. How much change might we expect with a changing climate in the future? And at what point does that change matter for the levee system? And next slide, please. And this is just a little reminder, the floodplain of where the Columbia Slough flows is a highly managed system. And so this is a diagram of the area with the levee system. It's about 27 miles. And it was created to protect the area from flooding of the Columbia River and the Willamette River. It goes basically from North Portland in the west to Troutdale in the east. So most of our watershed is within this levee system. And it's, of course, pertinent when you build something in the early 1900s. You want to know, is it going to hold up if the kind of flow we're getting in the rivers might change? And so with that, I'd like to hand it off to Keith. Please introduce yourself, Keith.
Hello, can you hear me? My name is Keith Duffy. I work with the Army Corps of Engineers here in the Portland District as part of the Northwest Division of the Army Corps of Engineers. And I've been working in as a civil engineer, but in water resources as a hydraulic and hydrology engineer for over 20 years. And with the Corps of Engineers, I've been working in H&H and climate change for over 10 years. So we had a project that came up, and I want, this is kind of an opportunity to exemplify what a civil engineer, water resource guy is doing to consider climate change, and what the Corps of Engineers is doing as we are part of a big system, many stakeholders, federal and others, that help manage the Columbia River as well as the Willamette. So with that, I will go into the presentation and answer questions afterwards. Thank you.
A couple of years ago, actually 3 or 4 years ago, the USGS and the Corps of Engineers were approached by MCDD folks. They wanted to know if it was possible to conduct a climate change assessment for Columbia River and the Willamette River, with special emphasis and focus on the MCDD levees. Their question of concern was whether or not climate change information, hydrology, as well as sea level, and how it could potentially affect the Columbia and the Willamette rivers, how that may affect the MCDD levees, and in particular for high water events. With the climate change information that we knew in the modeling, would we be able to determine if there was a likelihood of a change in the high water that might be experienced at the MCDD levees in the future? In short, I was tasked to develop some inflow hydrographs for our hydraulic models that represented plausible future high water conditions in the Willamette and in the Columbia River. To do this, I looked at, of course, climate change information that was newly available at the time, as well as past period of record observed data that we traditionally look at. What was the river flows that have been recorded in the past on the Columbia and the Willamette? We were interested in what might happen in the future at a target water year. And in our case, we used 2040 as that target water year. So we took data that was available. That data had been developed previously by others, starting with projected greenhouse gases, feeding global climate models that were then downscaled. The result of that were then put into hydrologic models that produced surface runoff or river flow projections for the future condition. There was a large group or ensemble of future natural flows that were available to us. And I used those flows and looked for, because we were interested in the high water, a scenario that was a plausible high water generating event. And so we looked at a GCM runoff data set that represented a warmer and wetter future condition in the 2040s. From that particular GCM data set, I was able to determine the future signal in terms of whether during the, on average per water year, what a scale factor might be for a future high water event. And we did this by comparing in the climate change data, a future condition run to which represented the higher level greenhouse gas concentrations to a simulation that was run with information that was consistent with historical levels of greenhouse gases. In that comparison, you can get a scale factor of the difference. And that was the future signal for the river flows be used in our hydraulic modeling. The next step was to come up with a prototypical hydrograph inflow pattern that is a storm event that the hydrograph represents that was plausible. And I looked back at the historic record to see what kinds of events created the highest stages at the levees. And again, annually, you get the highest annual stages during the wintertime. You have a high runoff event on the Willamette and then high water on the Columbia, driven oftentimes in the wintertime by atmospheric rivers for Pacific Northwest, similar to what happened in 1996. And also during springtime, freshet, where you have a high snowpack may generate a high runoff at the Columbia River at the levees. The critical event appeared to be one that drives some of the highest historic water surfaces was that atmospheric river represented by February 1996 event. Took that inflow pattern and applied a future climate signal increase or scale up factor, and then used that as the future condition inflow hydrographs. And those inflow hydrographs were then put into the model, handed off to the hydraulics folks, and were run to make some estimates of water surfaces on the MCDD levees, which was to address the original questions posed by the sponsors of the study. So with that, I will let Susan Wary, the hydraulic modeler, discuss in further detail her part of the study. Thank you very much.
That was great. Perfect setup for us to hand it off to Susan, co-author on the study. Susan.
Hi, can you hear me okay? I hope. So I'm Susan Wary. I'm a hydrologist with the USGS and the Oregon Water Science Center in Portland. And my work typically involves reviewing water quality data, in particular from lakes like Upper Klamath Lake and Crater Lake, and also working on various climate change projects like the one that we're talking about here today. So like Keith was mentioning, this was a cooperative project between USGS and the Corps of Engineers. And I helped with modeling the Lower Columbia River using some of the scaled up inflows that Keith helped to generate. So for this study, we used two different hydraulic models to compare simulations of water elevation around the Portland area. The two models that we used were the Delft 3D flexible mesh model, which is has a little bit of information in the top panel, and the adaptive hydraulics model, which is highlighted a little bit more in the bottom panel. For this work, we calibrated both models and then compared the results just to help ensure that we were more accurately covering our elevation in the Portland area. The models operate very similarly, but the key differences between them for this project were the differences in the grid resolution. The Delft model had a much coarser grid, and the levee features and pile dike features were actually added into the grid as separate features that were assigned an elevation. Whereas in the ADH model, there was a much finer grid, which you can just see from the diagram here in the Portland area. And it was so fine that levee and pile dike features could actually be mapped within the resolution of the grid. So there was a lot of fine detail there. And the models, these are just focuses in the Portland area, but they ran from the Bonneville Dam on the Columbia River side and from Willamette Falls in the Willamette River, all the way out to about 40 kilometers off the coast at the mouth of the Columbia River, using inflows from the Columbia, Willamette, Sandy, Lewis, and Cowlitz rivers. Next slide. Okay. So here is just a comparison of our calibration to the historical events. In the top panel, we can see the model results of Columbia River Stage in Vancouver for the 1996 event. In black is the measured stage, and the red and blue lines are the simulated stage by our two hydraulic models. And we were happy with how well the two models captured stage and were in pretty tight agreement with each other. We also used our calibrated models to run a springtime event, and that's the bottom panel, just to ensure that the models could work with a more Columbia River driven flood versus a combination Willamette and Columbia River flood like in 1996. So in our bottom panel, our 1997 springtime flood event also shows pretty good agreement between the two models and the measured stage at Vancouver. Next slide. So once our models were calibrated and we felt that they were in good agreement with each other and the measurements, we used the scaled up inflows that Keith was just talking about to then force our models. And what we can see here are the results of the Columbia River stage with extreme but plausible future conditions for both of our models. So this incorporates the scaled up inflows from the various rivers and also differences in sea level change that are outlined in the black, blue, and red lines. We considered 0, a quarter meter, and 1 meter rises in sea level change, just to ensure we're sort of covering a variety of scenarios. So the big takeaway from this for us was, again, that the two models were matching each other pretty well, but the deviation from the 1996 flood was certainly pretty high. You know, both models are showing at the peak stage over 1 meter higher than what was seen in 1996. So again, these are extreme but plausible conditions that we were running our models through. Next slide. And just to emphasize the finding of this study, the models were showing that under these extreme conditions, the Columbia River could potentially rise as much as 4.5 feet higher than events seen in the past, which I'm sure many people do remember as being a pretty significant flooding event in the recent past. Next slide, please. And what that would actually mean in terms of the levees in the Portland area, we used the elevation of the levees around Pen 1 and Pen 2 as determined from LIDAR, just to get a sense of how the peak elevation was comparing to the levee elevations. So the high and the low points or elevations of the levees are, they cover a slight range, but based on our LIDAR, we could find the low point. So for Pen 1, the low point of that levee was the 11.07 meters. And based on using this low point, the extreme but plausible future model runs would show that levee overtopping by just about almost 0.1 meters or a quarter foot for the lowest sea level change scenario. And that it could overtop by as much as almost 0.5 meter or 1.5 feet for the highest 1 meter sea level change scenario. And similarly for Pen 2, we found the low point of that levee based on the LIDAR, and we're able to compare that to the nearest point river elevation in the Columbia River, and that levee was very close to overtopping based on our model runs. Next slide, please. For the MCDD and SDIC levee systems, again, we didn't see any overtopping in our future model runs, but just again, the river elevation would be rather close to the low points of those levees. And last slide, please. And one of the other changes that we thought was interesting and significant for this study was not only could the river elevation be a bit higher than we've seen historically, but that the high river levels could last longer than we're seeing in, say, the 1996 event. So for example, in 1996, the flood exceeded the 26-foot mark for 5 days and was around that height for about 11 days. Whereas in our future climate runs, those high river elevations lasted for a much longer period of time. So river elevation above 26 feet was lasting for more like 21 days. And this could just lead to problems with the levees, having seepage or just failure that we aren't looking at in this study, but we could see that's something that should be considered. All right.
Thank you very much, Susan. It's great to be able to hear directly from the researchers about the study, because for people like me, lay people trying to get through the final thick report and very technical. So I appreciate getting an overview. I did want to mention, tonight we're focusing on sort of thematic issues, and we do not have representatives from Multnomah County Drainage District or Levee Ready Columbia on the panel. We were planning to do a separate webinar down the road, probably in the fall, with folks from there to talk more about their operations, what they do. But I just wanted to assure people, since we were presenting findings that could be worrisome if you live in the floodplain, that the drainage districts, of course, are preparing, and working on making sure that the system is there to protect life and property. And this is a picture from a 2019 emergency training exercise where they install a flood wall. And I put a couple of web links there if you would like to learn more. Next slide, please. So going back to Guillaume's framework of the factors that that implicate risk. The third was really, what is our capacity to adapt? And Megna's work really falls in this, because one of the features that has been brought up is not just how much money you have to manage or technological responses you might have available to you, but also, are the people who are most impacted, are they involved in the decision-making processes, or what kind of social infrastructure do we have, not just economic or technological, to prepare and respond and recover? So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Megna.
Thank you, Kathy. Can you guys hear me fine? All right. So hi, everyone. My name is Megna Babur-Stevens, and I'm an associate professor in civil engineering and water resource engineering and civil engineering at OSU, at Oregon State University. And a lot of my research that I do is around the question of how can we use technology to help communities make better decisions, especially when it comes to engaging your stakeholders, your community, individuals who live in the landscape, and how do we involve them into developing and creating natural resources management solutions, including solutions for, tackling change problems. But can technology be used towards that, and so that we can create solutions that are more acceptable to the community? Right, with that, Ryan, you want to start the video? Thank you. As communities think about how best to manage their flood risks in their watersheds, it is important for us to think more broadly and more comprehensively about the different types of solutions that could be used towards that. While current and future flood risks could be managed through a range of different solutions on the main channel, through like flood control dams and reservoirs and levees and so on, to mitigate flooding in the main channel as well as in the floodplains. We also need to think about our own watersheds and catchments where we live and explore the conditions of our watersheds to think about, how can we improve the storage capacity of our watersheds to store a lot of these floodwaters? And are there places in the landscape where other kinds of solutions could be implemented? Now, identifying such strategies across the watershed landscape for improving flood resilience is not a very straightforward problem. In fact, it's pretty complex because you not only have the physical environment you're working with, but also your community stakeholders and individuals and landowners who you have to involve in that decision-making process. And so you can't just solve this problem behind a piece of paper. You really need more improved strategies. And humans and machine collaboration is one way to think about how to use the power of the machines to help develop different strategies, and then how to use the power of our humans to use human knowledge to explore what strategies might be more acceptable to a community as you think about restoring a certain watershed. So past watershed solutions have usually involved a range of different civil engineering infrastructure, like I said, dams and levees and so on. And while these have been really useful for managing floods, but they've also had their own problems. So as climate changes and our precipitation patterns change, many of these previous solutions, they have now essentially filled their capacity and don't have any more capacity to store additional flood waters that we might see in the future. Further on, many of our infrastructure also has other kinds of problems and challenges that it can create with respect to, for example, impact on water quality and ecological habitats that are the receiving end of this infrastructure. So a lot of researchers and scientists and practitioners have explored this idea of ways to re-naturalize the degraded watersheds. This could be through a range of different conservation practices in agricultural landscape, like wetlands and strip cropping, cover crops, that try to keep the water that falls from the sky in the catchment, in the watershed, in the landscape, instead of letting it just quickly pass into the channel and cause flooding problems. And the same ideas are also being explored in urban environments, like through strategies like green infrastructure or LIDs, like green roofs, rain gardens. But in big picture, they've all worked pretty much the same. They're using nature to help us manage these floods by storing the water up in the landscape. But as you start thinking about exploring solutions for watershed restorations through a range of different nature-based solutions and strategies, it's important to realize that stakeholder engagement is even more critical, because we have people who live on this land, and we have to think about their local site conditions, their biases, their behaviors, attitudes, their experiences, and all of these can be very diverse. For example, some stakeholders might be more interested in the cost versus others might be more interested in different kinds of benefits that many of these nature-based solutions might have for flood management. And then some of them might be more focused on their on-farm costs and benefits versus other folks like policymakers who might be looking at the entire watershed catchment as a whole. So watershed management plans, when you generate these kinds of nature-based strategies for restoring your watershed, require a lot more broader participation and consensus of your entire community. So while engaging humans and our stakeholders is anyways a challenging task, it's also important to realize that designing watershed solutions and alternatives or different types of plans for restoring watersheds is also a very challenging task. So here is a map of, for example, in a watershed in the Midwest, here's a map of a large number of wetlands. About almost 3,000 sites have been identified here that could be restored and converted back into wetlands for storing additional flood waters. But this means that if you can just see among 3,000 wetlands, you cannot go ahead and essentially install all of these wetlands or restore all of these wetlands. And so the decision space is huge in terms of trying to identify what combination of these wetlands might work the best for this watershed, as well as there can be multiple goals that might be important. For example, the cost of the wetlands, the maintenance management, as well as other kinds of benefits that wetlands might have with respect to not just flooding, but other co-benefits too, like water quality benefits and sediment loss benefits and things like that, and also like habitat restoration and habitat support. So the decision space is huge. The goals are conflicting and there are multiple goals. So trying to identify a watershed plan that might work for a community will also require some amount of computational help to look at all the different scenarios that might actually help restore this watershed. So there is a field of human computation that looks at designing collaborative human and machine systems that work together to accomplish tasks that neither the human or the machine could do it by themselves. So in our research, we were trying to explore human computation approaches where we could leverage the power of the crowd in a watershed community to identify what kinds of watershed plans for restoring the watershed would be more community preferred and help at the same time help the community reduce their flood risks. So to explore our different approaches, we used a web-based decision support tool called Restore, which is a tool that you can use to engage with your stakeholders in the watershed and obtain feedback from them to identify which watershed plans of conservation practices or other kinds of nature-based flood management solutions might be more acceptable to them. An important benefit of using such technology-based solutions is that you can engage multiple stakeholders and individuals into the design process and then use their feedback to learn what kinds of watershed scenarios or alternatives might work better for them. So say, for example, in this slide, I see two different participants, and each circle that you see in each of the graphs are essentially different watershed plans that these participants have generated. The green circles are the ones that these participants prefer and would like to implement in their watershed. You can compare them and say, all right, well, how do these plans compare to each other with respect to attaining peak flow reduction, which is your watershed flood management goal, as well as at a cost that is acceptable or feasible for this community. The other benefit is that you can then look at a range of different designs that the community generated and which the designs that they liked, and then create these kinds of maps that you see on the slide here on the kinds of conservation practices that are preferred in different spatial locations of your watershed. So for example, the blue polygons you see in these watershed maps are places where cover crops are highly preferred by the community, and the same thing over here in this particular map where the filter strip are preferred to be much wider by the community on an average. In the end, I'd like to thank our funding agencies and leave the question for all of you as to how do you think human-machine collaboration could help your community tackle complex climate change mitigation and adaptation problems. With that, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. This was great. I've learned a lot in working with you all and helping prepare the presentations. So I want to remind folks listening tonight that you can post questions in the Q&A or the chat. I think Ryan will be able to catch them either place. And then he'll let me know and we can open up the convo. But I would like to kick things off. Meghna, one of the things that strikes me about your work is that it seems like it dovetails really nicely with more traditional engineering or hard science project planning and decision-making processes, or maybe not. But I'm just curious, what has the sort of adoption been like among those more traditional fields? Do you see there being more opportunity? And if so, how can we help facilitate that increase in uptake?
Thanks for that question, Kathy. So, yeah, there's a lot of things you pointed out there in that question. I think, so when you think about stakeholder engagement, in the past, we've always tried to engage our community through a range of different mechanisms like workshops, these kind of, community engagement opportunities, but, or interviews and things like that. But when it comes to adoption, especially, for example, in some of the work that I was talking about earlier in the Midwest, we'll be looking at, agricultural landscapes and trying to improve the storage capacity in agricultural landscapes for flood management. Adoption has always been a challenge. And, it can be related to a lot of different factors. For example, like, is there a cost mechanism to support implementation of the solutions that you're recommending to the community? Are there some, are there barriers to that? Or, for example, like incentives, like how does it support, likelihood for adoption? Or even things like, what people's priorities are in terms of their previous experiences. So, but when you have a large community, you're trying to get an understanding of what, how do you as a planner find what are the places where things might be more readily adopted, and are there other alternate solutions that your local community can also recommend? So trying to create that democratic platform, is something that I think engineers can learn from, where we sort of, use our traditional engineering approaches of design and modeling, but then work using technology to gauge like feedback from our community through technology. So this was not possible in the past when we didn't have technology so readily available to a lot of communities. And of course, there's still barriers to access to many of these, like things like smartphones and computers and stuff like that. There's still barriers, but like as you move forward in the future, I think, there is a push towards people being more and more involved in decision making through these kind of technologies. So if there's a way for us to use that as a way to get feedback from a larger number of people versus just a few folks in the room who, are maybe the loudest folks in the room, right? What that can do is it can sort of help merge the engineering side of design with the social aspects of your community, which are important to actual, identification of what works for the community. So in this work that I talked about in the video, we were working with some of the agencies back in the Midwest to explore these kinds of opportunities. So it was very research-based and experimental-based. So I think we're still in the process of trying. There's so many questions that came up in terms of like, what kind of technology tools we need, what kind of privacy issues will be there. So there's a lot of ongoing work with this, that in terms of full-blown implementation. So what we have right now are our early findings of how do you engage communities and what do you learn from that. And then as we think about scaling it up to actual implementation, what things do we need to think about in terms of infrastructure or even, information, like tools, like for example, what Gulyam was talking about earlier, right? So how do you sort of integrate those kinds of tools along platforms like these? I think there's still a lot of work to be done in that area. And but I think we're getting there. We're just, it's a good question. I guess I have, there's still answers, but there's still many of these things that we don't have answers yet. But, we're getting there in terms of scaling it up and actually making it a tool that people can use right away.
That's awesome. Yeah, it definitely, I'm imagining technology is usually not the limiting factor. It's our ability to incorporate it to influence and change the way decisions are made. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
Well, staying on the social topic, I'm curious, Guillaume, you mentioned that the field has not done as good a job of exploring that ability to adapt, capacity to adapt. And so I'm just curious, in your mind, what does that social adaptive capacity look like?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I should say that there's been a lot of work on this. It's part of what I was saying there is I haven't done a lot of work on it, right? I'm coming from kind of the numbers geek predilection that I have myself, and realizing that there's more to the world than that. So I think that I think in some ways this is kind of stating the obvious, right? It's, if you want to fix something, it's not enough to like do a bunch of modeling to quantify the extent of the problem, right? It takes more than that. People, like Meghna has been very eloquently showing, people have to be on board with the solutions that you're coming to, and then it has to be, ideally we want them to be equitable and inclusive, right? So I think that already points to many of the factors, right? Who is involved in decision making? Are their voices heard? Are the plans that come about reflective of their needs and interests? But it's also, I think, a mixture. It's also what are the sorry, so just talk a little bit more about that. That gets at things like social cohesion and cooperation, right? But there's also some interplay with the institutions that are there to respond, right? So that can be diking districts, it can be, it could be community groups, it could be governments, right? And there, it's a little bit nebulous, and it depends on where you're looking, right? But it's things like how nimble those organizations can be, right? And how much autonomy they have, and how well coordinated they are with similar interests and objective, other groups that are doing similar work, right? So it's the sort of things that I think are probably really obvious to folks, maybe some of which are on this call, who sort of are more kind of on the ground, seeing what the implications are and what the options are for responding.
Great, thank you.
We do have a question right now coming in from Bob. Thanks, Bob, for your question. The potential for storm events of greater rainfall magnitude with climate change have been recognized. How does the panel feel about the possibility of smaller localized flooding events inside of the levees? Anyone feel free to take that.
I suspect this is probably a Susan and Keith question, but you didn't look at that in your study. So it's hard to say.
Yeah, this is Susan. So for this study in particular, the Multnomah County Drainage District was very curious to understand what sort of event it would take, or with an extreme future event, could the levee even be crested? So that was sort of the focus of our study, but absolutely, people are going to care about whether or not their own home is getting flooded because of, storm water backup in local creeks and things like that. I think those are very important things to look at in a flooding study. For this particular, task, we didn't go down to that kind of detail. And, our range really just focused on these big river inflows, and we didn't look at the more detailed, stormwater systems and smaller creeks that people really tend to live with. But, those types of studies could be done too, and that type of modeling could be looked at as well. It's not the only way to look at the problem, but it can help certainly identify areas that are more at risk due to a variety of reasons, not just one sort of extreme rainfall event, but the particular stormwater system that somebody's living with that could lead to flooding in their own home. So I think it's important, but like Kathy said, we didn't go down to that kind of detail in this study.
I may just add that what Susan said about the focus of this study was kind of higher up in the watersheds and the river inflows, and so kind of localized stormwater wasn't specifically looked at, but the kind of overarching climate science, from the trend side of things for precipitation, does point to more variability and more a tendency for some more extreme precipitation events. And so that could be translated to kind of local behind the levees, local to Portland, Vancouver area, as well as up in other portions of the Pacific Northwest. So just I'd add that. It's something that is definitely in the realm of possibility, and depends on the study focus, like Susan was saying.
Yeah, I think this is an area that probably City of Portland, Bureau of Environmental Services, and City of Gresham, it's municipal level stormwater system area of interest, and so that would be a good topic for us to dig into more, because that is what we experience more on the day-to-day. The big expensive hard infrastructure investments like dams and levees are a little bit out of touch in terms of our ability to influence day to day. So I've got a question for Susan and Keith. I know that, well, like any scientific field, climate science has and is evolving fairly rapidly. And so this study was done a couple of years ago. Was there, when you consider the kind of data you have now, do you anticipate that the results would be meaningfully different, or how does that work from your perspective? Like, what's the sort of longevity of your studies in climate change?
I may start out, from the hydrology side of things. Kind of that's what feeds the river estimates and modeling that Susan does. So, we did use kind of previous iterations of global climate models, kind of what was available at the time. And we've had a couple of iterations, we call them kind of CMIP. It's kind of a consortium that kind of consolidates all the climate change GCM data and puts it out in a little bit more usable format. And so we are coming up to what we call CMIP 6. So, but we've done studies as we've been transitioning between different iterations of climate change information, and the overall trends are similar. It's the kind of resolution and the granular details that differ between the different kind of GCM information iterations. But I guess, from our standpoint, we think that a lot of the trends that we were looking at for this study would be plausible in the context of other data sets. So I'll let Susan speak to some other changes on her side of things.
I mean, I agree with what Keith is saying, that I don't know that the overarching trends are coming out very differently now, but, we could always, this study took a lot of effort to build these models and to calibrate them. And now that we have them, it would certainly not be that much work to, reevaluate the inflows with new climate data and rerun our models and see if just modifying, if the scaling factors do change to those inflows, whether it's slightly lower or slightly higher, does that in turn have an even bigger impact on the types of flood stage we're seeing in our model runs? That could be a very straightforward test just with the sort of the hardware that we already have, but that's my thought on that.
That's very cool. Return on investment. And Guillaume, you mentioned you'd like to chime in here.
Yeah, I mean, I think Susan and Keith have looked at the details, but I think the thing that I wanted to add to that is just that the real question is how much would it have to be different to matter? And that's where I think there's a lot to learn from what they've already done, and also from knowing the system, as I think some of the folks on the call probably do, and to maybe flip the problem around and just ask when, what are those thresholds where we start to see problems, or how much bigger of a problem it is as it goes higher and higher, right? And that can help to to determine if there really is a need for a whole bunch more modeling, or if there's enough information already to say, you know, it is or it isn't a problem, depending on where you're looking.
Right, so if the question is about the saturation, right, which it sounds like that requires further study, then you'd be trying to incorporate the best, latest data.
Yeah, I mean, maybe, right? But I mean, I think it's at what level of saturation is there a problem, right? Is you know, and then if the models say it's getting worse, then we know it's going to be more than it currently is, right? If it's already past that level in their modeling, and the new models say it's getting worse, then it's more, right? I mean, it's already bad. So you already know what you need to do in that case, right? So it doesn't change. I think that's the perspective I'm trying to say. It's like the end game isn't to have a better number, right? It's to know what to do, and then you want to think about it in that terms, is to change what you're going to do in the end.
That's awesome. That is actually a beautiful way to close the evening as we think about what the climate will look like over the years and how we'll experience it and how we're going to be able to respond in a way that will continue to allow for a healthy watershed and a healthy community. And I think in a highly engineered and urbanized system like ours, it will be a very interesting question to see where's there potential to renaturalize some areas perhaps. What is the connection here way down at the end of the Willamette to floodplain habitat in the middle and upper Willamette? How would that play a role in protecting Portland International Airport, right? You know, so being able to see our connections and within our watershed and in the larger drainage. And so with that, I just want to say thank you all very much. I learned a lot. I really appreciate you all sharing your expertise and your work. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you. It's great.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Have a good night, everyone.
Night. Goodbye.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.